Because what Elias Carter did wasn't chaos. It was a consequence, a mirror held up to the very world that created him. And the truth, the one whispered only in locked archives, is simple. They were not afraid of the man. They were afraid of the liturgy he began. They said Elias Carter came into this world during a thunderstorm that split the Virginia sky in half. Old midwives whispered that the lightning struck twice the moment he cried, once across the clouds, and once in the eyes of the men who would later try to own him. By the winter of 1886, Elias had already become a myth, the kind whispered between plantation walls, passed from terrified overseer to trembling patrolman. They said he walked like a man who carried no heartbeat. They said he looked at white men the way soldiers look at enemies on a battlefield. They said he had no fear, because fear had been beaten out of him before he could even speak. But the truth was worse. Elias Carter learned fear young. He just learned to use it. As a boy, he watched his father hanged for teaching himself to read. He watched his mother being whipped until she forgot her own name. And when he turned 13, the overseer carved a number into his shoulder, 47, the number of lashes he deserved for talking back. That scar never healed, nor did the memory. By 1886, Elias was no longer a boy. He was a quiet, broad-shouldered man who worked without complaint, spoke only when necessary, and listened more than anyone realized. Slaves who slept beside him at night said he whispered strange things in his dreams. Battlefield prayers, words that sounded like strategies, names of men no one knew. Elias kept his eyes down. His voice is low. His anger was buried. But beneath that calm exterior lived a storm that had been building for 20 years. A storm that had been fed by blood, sharpened by grief, and ignited by a single event. The moment he discovered what really happened to his younger sister the night she disappeared. Listen closely, because what you're about to hear was never meant to leave the soil it was buried in. For more than a century, officials claimed the testimonies were missing, the reports lost, the witnesses unreliable. They were not lost. They were hidden. On a cold November night in 1886, long after the South had convinced itself that fear had died with old rebellions, something awakened in Virginia. Not a rumor, not a legend, a force. It began with a sound people still struggle to describe. A dragging rhythm across the pine floor, a wet breath against the outside of a cabin wall, and then a whisper, Elias Carter. If you don't know the name, then the cover-up worked on you. If you do, then you already understand that this is not a story. It's a confession. Carter was born into a world designed to crush men before they even learned their own strength. A world that survived on obedience, silence, and the illusion of control. In 1886, Virginia still carried that world like a parasite under its skin. But Elias Carter wasn't obedient. He wasn't silent. And he learned very early that control is just another word for fear. He was not broken by the system. He was sharpened by it. Locals claimed he used to stand beside the old fields at night, staring at the soil as if it were breathing. He said the earth remembered everything. Every chain, every scream, every unmarked grave. And he said that one day, the ground would ask for something back. That day arrived. Across 56 hours, Carter moved through the backwoods like a shadow that had torn itself free from its owner. Silent, precise, inevitable. By dawn on the third morning, 80 people were dead. Cabins torn apart from within. Doors found locked from the outside. The air was thick with a stillness that survivors refused to explain. The governor sealed the reports. Militia men vanished from records. Entire hamlets were wiped from maps. That truth broke something inside him. And the quiet man the South thought it understood became something else. Something colder. Something calculated. Something that did not fear death. Because death had already taken everything from him. By the end of November 1886, Elias Carter would unleash a terror that would burn itself into Virginia's memory forever. But here, in the shadows before the chaos, stood the simple truth. Elias didn't want revenge. He wanted justice, and he was willing to carve it from the living. The first disappearance happened on a night so still, even the crickets refused to speak. It was November 1886, 3 days before the killings would begin, though no one in Virginia yet understood that a clock had started ticking. The overseer's name was Jonas Reddick, a man whose cruelty was the kind that didn't need alcohol to wake. He carried it in his bones, like a sickness inherited from his father, and his father before him. Slaves said Reddick smiled only when he heard someone scream. They said the devil sent him, but even the devil feared the things Jonas enjoyed. At sunset that evening, Jonas dragged Elias Carter's younger sister's locket from his pocket. Shiny, dented, stained at one edge with something no rain had washed away. Jonas didn't know Elias saw him, but Elias did, and that was the moment everything changed. By midnight, Jonas Reddick was gone. No lanterns, no horses disturbed, no footprints leading away. Just one thing left behind on the ground outside the tool shed. A single slash in the dirt, clean, straight, deliberate, as if someone marked the earth with a blade. A warning, or a promise. The plantation owner, Mr. Harwood, called it foolish superstition. Jonas got drunk and wandered off, he said, but the slaves whispered something different. No man wanders into the swamp near Dead Crow Creek. Not at night. Not alone. The swamp was a place even hunters avoided. Old stories claimed the soil there was wrong, the water slow and black, the air thick with the breath of things that used to be alive. If Jonas had run there, he hadn't run far. The next morning, when Harwood's men searched the edge of the swamp, they found Reddick's leather belt hanging from a branch, cut clean through as if sliced by something sharper than steel. Beneath it, pressed into the mud, lay a handprint. Not Jonas's. It was bigger, wider, and deeply stamped, as if made by a man who weighed far more than Elias Carter, or anyone living. Men started locking their doors that night. Women whispered prayers they hadn't spoken since childhood. And Harwood sent 2 riders into town with a message. Find Jonas, or find who took him. But Elias Carter said nothing. He worked his hours. He kept his head down. And the quiet storm inside him grew darker and colder. Because Jonas Reddick was only the beginning. By the time the riders returned from town, the air over Harwood Plantation felt wrong. Heavy, metallic, as if the sky itself sensed what Elias Carter was about to become. They carried with them a single letter. Not from the sheriff, not from any court, from a preacher, a man who claimed to know Elias Carter's bloodline. His name was Reverend Silas Thorne, a traveling minister whose sermons were whispered more than spoken. Sermons about judgment, about blood debts, about sins that passed from father to son like inherited curses. He had seen Elias once, 10 years before, when Elias was still a teenager and scars were still fresh across his back. The Reverend had stared at him too long, too knowingly, too calmly. Now his letter was back. Harwood read it in front of his men, squinting at the trembling handwriting. When the one with the carved number rises, no man who carries a whip shall sleep easily. The Lord may forgive, but the soil will not. Harwood didn't finish. He threw the letter into the fire, but flames did not take it. The paper curled, darkened, but refused to burn. A worker grabbed it with a pitchfork, tried to push it deeper into the fire, but the flames slid around it like water around stone. Harwood, sweating now, snatched it out with a glove and tossed it into a bucket of water. It floated, dry. That was when every man around the pit stepped back. Harwood ordered them not to speak a word. Superstition, he said. Trick paper. But every slave watching from the shadows knew the truth. The Reverend's words weren't a warning. They were a prophecy. That night, a messenger rode to Thorne's church on the edge of Dry Creek. He slammed open the doors to demand an explanation, but the church was empty. Pews overturned. Candles melted into the floorboards. Scratch marks on the altar, as if someone had been dragged across it. And on the pulpit lay a second letter, sealed with black wax. Inside, one sentence: "Do not seek the man you fear. He has already begun." The messenger fled back to the plantation without sleeping, without speaking, without thinking, because he realized what Harwood refused to believe. Elias Carter was not hunting randomly. He was following a path, a deliberate one written long before he was born. And the South was only days away from learning what that path led to. The first witness was a child, 8 years old, small, barefoot, and too innocent to understand why his voice made grown men tremble. His name was Caleb Rourke, the son of a poor sharecropper whose land touched the south edge of Harwood Plantation. Caleb was used to the dark, used to slipping between the tall corn rows when the sun fell, used to hearing the distant crack of whips, used to pretending he didn't hear the screams. But the night Jonas Reddick disappeared, he heard something else. Breathing. Deep, slow, steady. The kind of breathing a man makes when he isn't hiding, but waiting. Caleb thought it was an animal at first, so he crept closer. He pushed aside the stalks, stepped onto a patch of flattened earth, and saw a figure standing perfectly still in the moonlight, broader than any man Caleb had ever seen. Shoulders like carved stone, arms slack at his sides, head bowed slightly forward. Not moving, not swaying, just standing. Caleb opened his mouth to ask a question. He didn't even know what. But then the figure lifted its head. The moon caught its face, and Caleb froze. It was Elias Carter, but something about him was wrong. His eyes were open, but empty, like he was looking at something far beyond the field, something no one else could see. His chest rose and fell slowly, too slowly, like he was forcing himself to breathe. And below his right collarbone, the scarred number 47 looked fresh, red, as if carved minutes ago, not years. Caleb tried to run, but the corn behind him rustled first. Another sound, not human, a low, dragging whisper across the soil. Caleb didn't look back. He sprinted home, sobbing, waking the entire cabin, refusing to sleep until he had been checked head to toe for cuts, bites, or marks. The boy's father didn't believe him until morning, because at sunrise, the cornfield where Caleb saw Elias wasn't just flattened. It was carved, a perfect circle 20 feet wide. The corn bent outward as if something had expanded from the center. At the very heart of the circle lay a single boot print, Elias's, but deeper than any normal man could have stepped. So deep the footprint held water like a bowl. Harwood's men called it a sign. The slaves called it a warning. But the old women, the ones who remembered old stories from before America existed, they called it awakening. Elias Carter was no longer hiding in shadows. He was rising from them. 3 days after Caleb saw Elias standing in the cornfield, Harwood Plantation's main house trembled with panic because of something found where no slave had ever been allowed to step. In the locked study, beneath the creaking floorboards, lay a folded sheet of oil-treated paper. A map, old, stained, edges stiff with something dried and dark. Blood. Mr. Harwood didn't find it. His wife did. She had dropped a glass, watched it roll, and noticed the uneven board near the fireplace. Curiosity made her lift it. Regret made her scream. The map was unlike anything she had seen. No towns marked, no rivers named, only a series of symbols, circles, triangles, and long jagged lines carved into the parchment with a shaking hand. And at the center, written in faded ink, the 47 Paths of Judgment. Harwood snatched it away from her, furious that she had opened anything in his study. But when he unfolded it fully, his anger dissolved into something colder, because one of the circles, marked with a deep black X, sat exactly where his plantation stood. Another symbol, a dripping triangle, rested over the location where Jonas Reddick had vanished. A third circle, freshly smudged, matched the cornfield where the boy claimed he saw Elias Carter standing in the moonlight. Someone had marked these moments before they happened. Someone who knew what Elias was going to do. Harwood summoned his men. He demanded to know who broke into his home, who slipped beneath his floorboards, who dared touch his protected study. But no locks were broken, no windows forced, no tracks left behind. It was as if the map had always been there. One of the older slaves, Miriam, a woman whose eyes looked like they carried a century of storms, was brought forward to interpret it. Harwood shoved the map toward her. She didn't touch it. She didn't blink. She only whispered, "Sir, this ain't a map of places. It's a map of sins." Harwood's face tightened. Whose sins? Miriam turned her head slowly, painfully, toward the window, toward the fields where Elias Carter worked in silence. And she said the sentence that froze every man in the room. His father drew this. The night before they killed him, the study went silent. The fire crackled. Someone outside dropped a tool, and men flinched. Because if that map was truly drawn by Elias Carter's father, then Elias wasn't acting alone. He was finishing something, something planned long before he was born. Long before the killings began, before Virginia learned Elias Carter's name in terror, the slaves on Harwood Plantation began hearing a whisper. Not loud, not clear, but constant. It started as a faint rustling at night, like cloth brushing wood, like someone pacing slowly, carefully, deliberately in the hallway outside the sleeping quarters. But when the women pressed their ears against the cabin walls, they realized the sound wasn't coming from the hall. It was coming from beneath the floor, a low, rhythmic breath, in, as if something large lay hidden under the boards, waiting for the moon to fall asleep. Some said it was an animal trapped beneath the foundation. Others swore it wasn't an animal at all, because animals have heartbeat rhythms. This breath did not. It was too steady, too calm, too human. On the third night, the whisper began forming words. A woman named Ruth, widowed, tired, with hands hardened from decades of labor, heard it first. She woke her neighbors with a scream, claiming something spoke her name from under the floor. The next night it said another name. Not a woman's, a man's. Elias. When Ruth whispered it to the others, they shivered, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. Elias hadn't been in the quarters for 2 nights. He had slept outside, near the tool shed. So how could his name be whispered from beneath the boards? The elders in the quarters began muttering old words, forbidden words, prayers they had buried decades ago. They said the whisper was not calling for Elias. It was calling to him, drawing him, marking him, preparing him. One old man, Abram, broke down shaking. "I heard that voice before," he whispered, "when his daddy was taken. Same whisper, same floor, same breath." The younger slaves asked what he meant, but Abram refused to speak again. He only muttered 2 sentences until sunrise. "They come in bloodlines. They don't stop until the circle closes." By the following morning, the whisper stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse, because everyone in that cramped wooden room understood the truth. Something beneath the plantation had awakened, something that knew Elias Carter's name, something that had been waiting, patiently, hungrily, for him to hear it. And Elias did hear it. That night, he stood outside the quarters, eyes unfocused, head slightly tilted, listening to something no one else could hear. And for the first time, he smiled. News of Jonas Reddick's disappearance spread fast, too fast for Harwood to contain. By the 4th day, a sheriff from the nearest town, Sheriff Amos Kincaid, arrived with 2 armed deputies. Kincaid was not a kind man, but he was a confident one. He had a reputation, a cruel one. He'd broken escape attempts before they even became attempts. He walked like a man convinced no bullet could kill him. But when he stepped onto Harwood Plantation, something in his face changed. "The air's wrong here," he muttered. No one answered. He questioned the slaves harshly. He threatened. He swung a baton at a boy who hesitated. But every answer he got was the same. No one saw Jonas Reddick leave. No one heard him. No one found a trace. Then someone finally spoke. Miriam. She stepped forward with that quiet, trembling strength that made grown men uneasy. "You won't find him," she whispered. "Not alive." Kincaid snapped at her to be silent. She didn't flinch. "You won't find the next one alive either." The sheriff's hand froze on his holster. "What's next one?" Miriam turned her head toward the old storage barn. Its door slightly open, shadows thick inside. "The one already chosen." Kincaid barked an order at his deputies. They drew their rifles and marched toward the barn. The sheriff followed, swearing under his breath. They pushed the door open, and the world went silent. Inside the barn, leaning against a support beam, was Deputy Carter, Kincaid's youngest deputy. His eyes were open, his face calm. No wounds, no blood, no sign of struggle, not without help. On the floor beneath the dead deputy, carved into the dirt with terrifying precision, was a number, 47. The same number burned into Elias Carter's flesh. Kincaid stormed out of the barn, fury and fear tangled together. He grabbed Elias from the field, slammed him against the fence, and screamed, "What did you do? What did you do?" Elias didn't blink, didn't resist, didn't speak. He only lifted his eyes, cold, distant, ancient, and looked past the sheriff toward the barn. Not at the dead deputy, at the ground beneath him, as if he knew something was still there, still waiting, still hungry. That was when Kincaid finally understood. This wasn't a manhunt. This was a countdown. When sleep came to Elias Carter, it carried no peace. Instead, it brought visions so vivid and heavy that he awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, as though he had run a battle by moonlight. These were not dreams. They were summons. Each night for a week, Elias saw a figure shrouded in shadow, tall, silent, with arms stretched wide, as though holding up the sky. The figure never spoke, but when Elias looked into its face, he felt a terrible memory shaking loose, something older than his pain. In his visions, the land was different. Not the tobacco fields, not the cabins, not the worn dirt paths of Harwood Plantation, but something ancient. Trees that towered like cathedrals, a river glowing dark red, stones carved with strange symbols, half buried in moss, and always the same shape. A circle divided into 47 lines, 47 paths, just as on the map under Harwood's floorboards. In the dark, Elias stumbled to his knees. He whispered the prayer he'd never learned out loud, though no god he had been taught spoke to him like this. He murmured the number 47 until the word tasted like iron. He felt the weight of a covenant pressing on his bones, a promise made long ago, a debt waiting to be collected. He saw his father too, older, younger than he remembered. His father's eyes glowed faintly, and he reached out a hand, not to comfort, but to pass something. A blade, carved with that same circular symbol. When Elias took it in his vision, his fingers burned. But his father nodded, a deep, solemn nod, like a king passing a crown. And the vision ended. Elias gasped for breath in his small cabin. He stared at the ceiling. The boards above looked like they might twist, might break, might open a doorway to those ancient stones. He clenched his fists and felt every scar across his skin tighten, as though his body itself remembered that covenant. In the following days, Elias moved through the plantation with a new purpose. He watched Harwood's men with a predator's calm. He spoke less. He listened more. He carried a small satchel now under his work clothes, something heavy wrapped in cloth and bound by leather. He was not just a man anymore. He was a keeper of a promise, a bearer of a debt. And when the moment came to collect, the land itself would answer with blood. On the 10th night after Jonas Reddick vanished, the plantation ground itself began to change. Not all at once, not loudly, but quietly, too quietly, like something waking beneath a blanket of earth. It began near the far fields, where the soil was dry and cracked, untouched since last harvest. The slaves noticed it first. The dirt seemed looser, as though stirred from below. Footprints didn't settle normally. Tools left overnight leaned at strange angles, as if the ground refused to hold them. By sundown, even the overseers noticed. Their horses refused to walk across the backfield. One horse bucked so violently it shattered its reins and tore away into the tree-line, screaming until the sound faded into a broken whimper. Harwood dismissed it all as nonsense, until the trembling began. Not an earthquake. Earthquakes strike and vanish. This was a pulse, a heartbeat, slow, heavy, rhythmic, the kind of rhythm that made lantern flames bend as if bowing, the kind that shifted dust across wooden floors, the kind that turned every man's stomach to ice. Miriam was brought to the field. She knelt, pressed her ear to the dirt, and closed her eyes. When she stood, her hands were shaking. Something under this land is rollin' in its sleep, she whispered. "And it's waken faster." Harwood scoffed, ordered everyone back to work, and stormed away until he reached the edge of the field and saw the clearest sign yet. A straight line had formed in the soil, perfect, deep, stretching from the cornfield circle all the way to the slave quarters, like a route or a vein, as if the earth was connecting the places tied to Elias Carter. That night, long after the plantation fell silent, Elias stood alone in the moonlight. The wind did not touch him. His shadow did not seem to match his body, and under his bare feet, the ground pulsed again, once, twice, then a long, trembling exhale of dirt. He did not step back. He did not fear it. He only whispered, "You remembered," because Elias Carter knew this pulse. He had felt it once before, years ago, when they dragged his father from their cabin and pinned him to the earth. The ground had trembled the same way that night, like it resented the blood spilled on it. Now it trembled again, not in anger, in recognition. Something buried beneath Virginia was waking, answering the covenant Elias carried in his blood. And the South had no idea how little time it had left. By the 11th night, fear was spreading through Harwood Plantation like a sickness. Not because of Elias, because of the trees. The woods surrounding the property had always been silent, the kind of silence that felt natural, thick, warm. But now, that silence twisted into something sharper. The leaves rustled without wind. The branches creaked without weight. Birds refused to land on them. Even insects avoided the bark. But the first man to truly break was Overseer Dalton Briggs. Briggs was mean even by Harwood's standards. He carried his whip the way other men carried prayer books. He spat when slaves walked by. He enjoyed breaking bones. And he had been the one, years ago, who held Elias down while Harwood carved the number 47 into his skin. Now the forest remembered him. On the 11th night, Briggs stayed late near the boundary fence, checking traps. The sun had barely set when he froze, because someone whispered his name. "Briggs!" He spun, rifle raised. No one there. Just the trees swaying, except the air was still. He cursed under his breath and kept walking. Then he heard it again. "Dalton," this time closer, softer. "Vit," like breath dragging through blood. Briggs fired blindly into the dark. Silence. Then, slowly, every tree around him began creaking at the same time, bending ever so slightly inward. Not enough to break, but enough to feel deliberate. He backed away, fast, stumbling through brush. And then he saw them. Deep on the bark of one tree, fresh scratches. 5 long marks. Not from an animal. From fingers. Human fingers. Each scratch was deep, dark, and dripping with a thick, tar-like fluid that smelled of rust and old rain. Under the marks, carved with a trembling hand. "I remember." Briggs ran. He didn't care about traps, tools, or dignity. He sprinted across the field toward the main house, shouting for Harwood, but stopped dead when he reached the yard. Elias Carter was standing there, not walking, not moving, just standing, as though he had been waiting. Briggs raised his rifle with shaking hands. "You stay back. You stay." Something crashed in the woods behind him. A violent snap, branches splitting under immense pressure. Briggs spun, terrified. But the forest was still, too still. He looked back at Elias, only to find Elias gone, vanished into the dark without a trace. Briggs dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, because for the first time in his life the overseer understood. It wasn't Elias whispering his name. It wasn't any man. The land was calling him, and it wanted him next. The night the overseer fled, something ancient shifted in the air. The plantation was no longer just a place of labor and punishment. It had become a stage for a reckoning that had been written long before the first slave ship arrived on Virginia's shores. Elias Carter was no accident, no random spark of fury. He was the latest link in a chain bound by blood and betrayal, a chain forged in fire and hardened by centuries of silence. This was the blood debt, passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, carried in the marrow, and in the marrow deep scars no man could see. The scars that burned beneath Elias's skin, beneath the soil, beneath the very air. The plantation's owners thought they owned the land, the bodies, the lives, but they did not own the debt. And debts like this are never paid with money. They demand blood. They demand fire. They demand breaking the cycle. The elders whispered of it in hushed voices, warning young ones never to speak the words aloud. Because the blood debt was not just punishment, it was a curse that would tear through families, that would burn plantations to ash, that would twist men's minds until they shattered. Elias carried the weight of all who came before him. His father's disappearance was no accident. It was a warning written in silence. The chains that bound him were about to break, and when they did, the land would scream. Some men might see Elias as a madman, a monster driven by vengeance. But the truth was darker. He was a harbinger. The reckoning they had buried beneath the earth was ready to rise, and no one in Virginia would be safe. The plantation's nights grew heavier, thicker, as if the very darkness had weight. Inside the slave quarters, whispered rumors twisted through the cramped spaces like smoke. Talk of strange sounds, of shadows moving where no light reached, of footsteps that vanished before the ear could catch them. But it wasn't just whispers. Something was gathering, not in the open, not in the fields, but behind the walls, behind the locked doors of the old smokehouse, behind the cracked windows of the abandoned chapel, behind every place where those bound to the land dared not look. At night, Elias Carter would slip away from the others, moving like a shadow himself, drawn by a force unseen, a summons he did not question. He was meeting with others, men and women whose names were lost to history, whose faces never made it into records. They gathered silently, their eyes hollow and fierce, their bodies marked with signs and symbols older than Virginia itself. The air around them thrummed with energy, a pulse synchronized with the earth's own heartbeat beneath the fields. They spoke no words aloud, but their purpose was clear. They were the broken chain, the unforgotten debt, the living proof that the past never truly dies. They were preparing for what was coming, for the reckoning, for the fire, for the breaking. And somewhere deep inside Elias, a cold fire burned brighter than ever, because in that gathering, he understood the truth they had hidden from the world. The real battle was never against the men who owned the plantations. The real battle was against a darkness far older, a darkness rooted in the land itself. And to win, they would have to become something darker still. The number 47 was no accident, no random symbol scrawled in fear or madness. It was a mark, a brand, a key to something buried deep in blood and bone. Elias Carter bore it etched into his flesh, a brand that burned like fire beneath the skin, a tattoo of fate writ in pain and defiance. The plantation owners whispered that it was a curse, meant to break him, to remind him of his place. But Elias knew better. The mark was a binding, a connection forged long ago by blood-soaked hands and ancient pacts. It tied him to the land, to the roots beneath his feet, to the shadows that crawled beneath the fields like living things. When he pressed his palm to the earth, the soil responded, warm, alive, hungry. The mark pulsed. It was a warning, a summons, promise. Those who carried the mark were never truly free, but they were never truly slaves either. They were the guardians of a secret older than the nation, keepers of a debt owed not in coin, but in sacrifice. In the dark of night, Elias found himself drawn to a circle of stones deep in the woods, the same circle the elders spoke of in whispers, where the ground was said to bleed. He knelt there, tracing the shapes carved into the rocks. 47 lines, 47 paths, weaving together like a spider's web. The earth beneath him thrummed with life, with power, with wrath. He lifted his hand and carved the number into the bark of an ancient oak. The tree shuddered, and the night held its breath, because in that moment Elias Carter was no longer just a man. He was the living embodiment of the debt, the reckoning walking, and the South was about to pay. On the morning that the earth seemed to hold its breath, the fields were quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no insects, no footsteps except for those walking with purpose and shadow. Elias Carter moved like a storm, silent, swift, and relentless. He carried with him the weight of centuries, the fury of broken bloodlines, and a promise carved deep into his soul. The first strike came before dawn, like a ghost slipping through the mist. At the edge of the cotton fields, the men and women who had gathered beneath Elias' command descended with cold precision. No cries of mercy, no hesitation, only the sound of bones breaking, the dull thud of heavy blows, and the silent shattering of a world built on stolen lives. Plantation owners woke to horror, their homes breached, their families torn apart. The nightmare they had buried deep in the soil had risen, and it was hungry. In the aftermath, the land itself seemed to pulse with satisfaction, the soil soaking up the spilled blood like ink on a page. Every act was a message to those who would listen, a message that the debt was being collected, that the chains were breaking. But with every strike, the plantation's defenders grew desperate. Militia formed, guns were loaded, horses were mounted, and the hunt began. Elias knew the price of failure. He also knew the price of victory. Neither would be clean, neither would be easy. But one thing was certain. After this day, the South would never be the same. The rebellion had come to Harwood itself. The plantation that birthed Elias Carter was now its battleground. Walls that once held whispered deals and stolen moments of cruelty were stained with fresh blood, red as the fire that burned in Elias's eyes. Militiamen, armed with rifles and grim determination, surrounded the estate. They believed they could crush this uprising with force. But Elias had learned the language of the land, the language older than gunpowder and steel. He knew the soil would betray those who claimed to own it, that shadows clung to the corners, waiting. Inside the house, the air was thick with tension. Elias and his followers moved like phantoms through rooms once filled with laughter and lies. Every corner was a trap, every silence a threat. Outside, the militia fired blindly, bullets tearing through walls, shattering windows and splitting wood. But inside, Elias was no longer a man. He was the reckoning made flesh. With each step, the walls seemed to close in on the militia's confidence. The ground beneath their feet trembled, unseen roots writhing beneath stone. When the first militiaman fell, clutching his chest, eyes wide with shock, panic began to spread. No one knew what had struck him. No one saw the hand that pushed him down. But they felt it, the curse. Harwood was no longer a house. It was a tomb, a crucible, a war machine fueled by centuries of pain. And when the dawn finally broke over Southampton County, it revealed a plantation changed forever. One soaked in blood, bone, and a promise that only Elias Carter could keep. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the South held its breath. Harwood Plantation was no longer just a place of suffering. It had become a legend in blood and fire. Elias Carter's rebellion was no longer a ragtag group of desperate souls. It had transformed into something darker, something unstoppable. The slaves who once whispered his name in fear now chanted it in defiance. The broken chain was mending, one link forged in fire after another. From the swamps and forests, men and women answered the call. Silent figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their eyes burning with the same fury that ignited Elias's own. They moved like phantoms, striking with precision and vanishing before the militia could respond. Every raid, every attack was a calculated blow to a system built on cruelty and silence. And with every victory, the land seemed to awaken. The very ground beneath Virginia pulsed with power, the pulse Elias first felt beneath his feet. The soil remembered. It remembered the blood spilled, the chains broken, and the promises made in the dark. This was no mere rebellion. It was an uprising rooted in ancient pain and fueled by a force no man could control. The militia tried to hold their lines, but the shadow army was relentless. And Elias? He was no longer just a leader. He was a symbol, a reckoning, a nightmare the South could not escape. Every revolution carries a price. For Elias Carter and his followers, the cost was written in blood, paid not only by those who wielded chains, but by those who carried them. Among the rebels, whispers began of betrayal, of fear cracking iron wills, of men slipping away under cover of night, leaving others to face death alone. But the true betrayal was deeper, more insidious. It was the silence from beyond the borders, the cold indifference of a nation unwilling to confront its own darkness. The North watched as the South bled, calculating its own gain. Politicians spun words into webs, promising justice but delivering only more chains. For Elias, freedom was not a place or a promise. It was a war against every system built on control. But war reveals truths no man can hide. It reveals the hunger beneath smiles, the cruelty behind civility. And it demands sacrifice, sacrifices that would echo long after bullets stopped flying. The night sky bore witness as Elias stood alone, staring out over the fields he had set ablaze, not just with fire, but with a fury that would never die. He understood then that freedom was never free. It was a debt to be paid, a price to be collected. And the reckoning? It had only just begun. The forest around Southampton County had always held secrets. Ancient secrets, older than the plantations, older than the first settlers. But after the rebellion, those secrets awakened. Men spoke of strange lights flickering between the trees, ghostly figures moving just beyond sight. Whispers carried on the wind told of the lost, the damned, and the forgotten. Elias Carter's spirit, they said, was not gone. He had become one with the land. Some claimed that on moonless nights, his voice could be heard among the rustling leaves. A low chant, calling out the names of those who had fallen and those who had betrayed. The plantation owners grew paranoid. They hired hunters to track the spirits, to silence the shadows. But the more they hunted, the more the darkness grew. The soil soaked up their fear. The trees drank their desperation. And the land whispered back, because some debts can never be erased. Some chains, once broken, leave scars that bleed forever. And the true price of freedom is not measured in days or years. It is measured in the eternity of silence that follows the storm. When the news of Elias Carter's rebellion reached Richmond, the seat of power in Virginia, the corridors grew cold and quiet. The governor, a man sworn to protect order, chose silence over justice. Behind closed doors, deals were struck. Deals that would shape the future for generations. Official records disappeared. Witness testimonies were sealed. Histories rewritten. The rebellion was erased, not from memory, but from the pages where truth should live. Why? Because the fear was not just of the rebellion itself. It was the fear of what the rebellion revealed. That beneath the polished facade of democracy and law lay a system built on lies, on oppression, on the systematic erasure of voices that dared to demand freedom. The governor's silence was a pact, a binding contract with power itself, a contract that ensured the past remained buried and the debt remained unpaid. But the blood remembers, the soil remembers, and the truth? It never stays buried forever. Power does not relinquish control easily. Even as the rebellion was crushed, unseen forces moved behind the scenes. Watchers cloaked in shadow, guardians of the status quo. They infiltrated churches, courthouses, and plantations alike, ensuring that the truth would be twisted, suppressed, and weaponized. These watchers understood something few dared to acknowledge. Fear was the greatest weapon. Not just fear of chains or death, but fear of knowledge, fear of awakening. They monitored the whispers, the rumors, the flickers of rebellion that refused to die. Their eyes were everywhere, invisible, unrelenting. Men like Elias Carter were made examples, broken, then erased, so that others would learn submission. But submission is a fragile veil. Beneath it, the hunger for freedom simmers. The watchers may have controlled the narrative, but they could never control the fire burning in the souls of those who knew the truth. And as long as that fire burned, the watchers would always be looking over their shoulders. The chains that bound Elias Carter were not just iron and rope. They were chains of the mind, a prison built not of walls, but of fear, doubt, and control. From the moment of birth, the system sought to shape belief, to convince the enslaved that their fate was fixed, their voices meaningless. Religion was wielded like a blade, twisting scripture to justify bondage and obedience. Education was forbidden, knowledge a poison. Even in freedom, the chains lingered, internalized, invisible, yet no less binding. This mental prison was the most effective form of control, because it trapped the soul long after the body was free. Elias understood this better than most. His rebellion was not only against physical chains, but against the deeper cage of submission. And this cage persists, because true freedom is a revolution that never ends. It demands constant breaking of chains, both seen and unseen. Ask yourself this: what chains bind your mind today? Are you free or merely another prisoner of the system? Speak your truth below. Comment, break the chains twice to seal your resolve. This is your moment. The story of Elias Carter was not an isolated flame. It was part of a lineage, a bloodline marked by fire, silence, and rebellion. Generations before him had fought battles unseen, their voices muted by time and terror. Their sacrifices were the soil's secret. Their pain, the roots that nourished Elias's fury. But the curse of the bloodline was twofold. For every spark of rebellion, there was a shadow of destruction. Every act of defiance carried the weight of silence. Families torn apart, promises broken, futures stolen. The legacy was written in scars and whispered prayers. Elias inherited not just chains, but the fierce refusal to be broken. And that refusal echoed still, across the fields, through the swamps, into the very heart of history itself. The final hours of Elias Carter's rebellion were not just a battle. They were a reckoning, a collision of wills older than the nation itself. As the militia closed in, Elias stood tall, not as a man afraid of death, but as a force of nature embracing destiny. He was the fury of the oppressed made flesh, the voice of the silenced made thunder. Every swing of his blade was a declaration. Every fallen foe is a testament to the price of freedom. But the true reckoning was not in the clash of weapons. It was in the awakening of a nation's conscience. The rebellion cracked the illusion of control. It exposed the rot beneath the surface. And it reminded the world that some debts, no matter how deeply buried, will always come due. Because blood answers blood. And the hour of reckoning is never truly over. Elias Carter's rebellion was crushed, his body broken, his name buried beneath layers of silence and fear. But the shadows he cast never faded. They linger in the soil of Virginia, in the whispers between trees, in the hearts of those who remember. The system that sought to erase him only made his story more dangerous. Because truth, once unleashed, is like fire in dry grass, impossible to contain. Power fears the awakening of the mind, the breaking of chains, the reclaiming of a stolen destiny. You have heard what they tried to bury. You have seen the darkness behind the curtain. Now the question is yours. Will you let the shadows control you? Or will you rise, break your own chains, and walk into the fire? The legacy of Elias Carter is not just history. It is a call to awaken, a summons to all who dare to see beyond the lies. This knowledge changes a man forever. Remember it, live it, and above all, own it.